They say water is soft. You can cup it in your hands. You can drink it. It yields to the slightest touch. Rock, on the other hand, is hard. It is unmovable, jagged, and permanent. Logic dictates that when water meets rock, the rock wins. The rock always wins. But logic has never walked 2,300 miles across the spine of a divided America. In October 2025, a river began to flow. Not made of water, but of saffron robes and human skin. 19 Theravada monks stepping onto the asphalt of Key West, Florida, initiating what they called the Walk for Peace. From where I stood, entrenched in the modern world of efficiency and speed, it looked like madness. We live in an era where we can send a message across the globe in a millisecond. We can fly from coast to coast in 5 hours. Why, in the name of progress, would anyone choose to walk? Why choose the blistering heat of the highway when you could choose the air-conditioned comfort of a convention center? To the analytical mind, this mission was a statistical error, a glitch. 19 men with shaved heads and bare feet walking into the teeth of a country that was louder, angrier, and more polarized than it had been in a century. They were walking straight into the noise. But here is the thing about water. It doesn't cut through rock because of its strength. It cuts through rock because of its persistence. I watched them start, convinced I was witnessing a futile gesture. I was waiting for the rock, the cynicism of the world, to break them. I was waiting for the moment they would realize that silence is no match for the scream of the 21st century. I didn't know it then, but I was looking at the wrong variable. And I was looking at the rock when I should have been watching the water. There is a secret to this kind of endurance, a hidden mechanic to their movement that the cameras missed. It wasn't about where they were going, it was about what they were carrying. And what they were carrying was heavy enough to crush a normal man, yet they made it look like it weighed nothing at all. Let's look at the data. The United States, late 2025. A landscape fractured by ideology. You don't fix a broken engine by whispering to it, and you don't fix a divided nation by walking on the shoulder of Route 1. That was my argument. Practicality. We are obsessed with fixing things. We want legislation. We want policies. We want swift, decisive action. We want the surgery, not the therapy. So when these monks declared their intention was simply healing, I scoffed. Healing is a soft word. It belongs in yoga studios and self-help books, not on the gritty, oil-stained pavement of the American South. But watch them move. They don't walk as individuals. There is no leader barking orders, no stragglers checking their phones. They move as a single organism, a collective entity. When the monk in the front steps, the monk in the back shifts his weight. It is a biological rhythm, a hive mind of compassion. This wasn't a parade. It was a tactical deployment of peace. The skeptics, myself included, asked, "What is the ROI? What is the return on investment for these blisters?" The answer wasn't on a spreadsheet. It was in the air pressure around them. As they moved through towns that had been screaming at each other for years, the volume dropped. It was a physical phenomenon. The visual shock of that bright orange river flowing against the gray concrete forced people to pause. And in that pause, that brief, confused second, where a driver lifts his foot off the gas, there was a silence. They weren't trying to change the laws. They were trying to change the frequency. But frequency doesn't stop a semi-truck, and frequency doesn't stop the physics of a body colliding with steel. The world was about to test this healing theory with brutal kinetic force. By November, the novelty wears off. The Saffron River flowed into Texas, and Texas is not known for its hospitality to pedestrians. The heat rising off the tarmac in the deep south is enough to melt rubber, let alone human skin. The discipline required here is terrifying. They eat one meal a day. They do not handle money. They rely entirely on the generosity of strangers for survival. From a logistical standpoint, this is a nightmare. It is the ultimate inefficiency. You are putting your life in the hands of the very people you are trying to reach. And then, they added another variable, an unpredictability. They picked up a stray. Her name was Aloka the peace dog, a small, scrappy creature that decided to join the formation. To a strategist, this is a liability. You are walking 2,300 miles on a tight schedule, relying on donations, and now you have another mouth to feed. A creature that requires care, water, and slows the pace. Logic says, leave the dog. The mission is too important. Compassion says, the dog is the mission. Aloka the peace dog became the mascot of their vulnerability. She wasn't trained. She wasn't a prop. She was just there, or trotting alongside the robes, panting in the heat. She represented the chaos of the real world entering their perfect circle of discipline. And they didn't reject her. They absorbed her. They slowed down for her. It seemed like a mistake. It seemed like a weakness that would cost them. We were approaching Dayton, Texas. The roads were narrowing. The shoulders were disappearing. The traffic was getting faster, heavier, and less forgiving. The river was flowing into a bottleneck. I looked at the map, and I looked at the news. I saw the physics of a 60-mile-per-hour world colliding with a 3-mile-per-hour prayer. I prepared my eulogy for the mission. I thought the end would come from exhaustion, or politics, or perhaps the sheer futility of the task. I was wrong. The impact wouldn't come from the mind. It would come from a pickup truck. On November 19th. Dayton, Texas. The math finally caught up with them. It happened in a blur of motion that no amount of meditation could slow down. A pickup truck, a mirror, a body. The sound of impact is ugly. It's a wet, heavy thud that doesn't sound like the movies. It sounds like reality breaking. Ponte Dam was struck. He went down. In that second, the river stopped flowing. The formation broke. This was the moment I had predicted. This was the moment where the harsh reality of the world crushes the soft idealism of the spirit. Anger should have been the next sequence. Panic. Lawsuits. Shouting matches on the side of the highway. That is the script the world follows. When you are hurt, you lash out. When you are hit, you hit back. I watched, pen poised, ready to record the disintegration of their peace. But the script didn't play out. Instead of chaos, there was a sudden, terrifying calm. The other monks didn't scream. They swarmed, yes, but not with rage. They flowed around the fallen brother like water filling a void. They tended to him. And the driver? The person who had just inflicted violence upon this symbol of healing? They didn't attack him. They didn't curse him. They looked at him with the same gaze they used on the horizon. Ponte Dam was hurt badly. Broken bones. The kind of injury that ends a journey. Logic dictated that the mission was over. You lose a key member. The group morale fractures. The logistics crumble. The walk becomes a weight. But 2 days later, I saw something that defied the laws of efficiency. A wheelchair appeared. They didn't leave him behind. They didn't cancel the walk. They simply changed the mechanics. The river widened. If legs couldn't walk, wheels would roll. The collective hero adjusted its body to carry the wounded limb. It was infuriatingly resilient. It was a refusal to acknowledge the rock as an obstacle. They treated the accident not as a tragedy, but as just another mile to cross. And as Ponte Dam rolled forward, flanked by his brothers, the image shifted. They weren't just walking for peace anymore. They were rolling for it. They were bleeding for it. We crossed into the Bible Belt, the Deep South, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. This is a place where faith is strong, but it is also specific. A line of Buddhist monks in saffron robes walking through small, conservative towns is conspicuous. It's alien. It invites suspicion. Who are these men? What is their agenda? Are they invading? I could feel the tension in the air, the stares from front porches, the slowing of police cruisers. The cultural firewall was up. The theology was different. The language was different. The clothes were different. There was no common ground, except for the dog. Aloka the peace dog was the diplomat that no one expected. You see, you can argue about religion. You can argue about politics. You can argue about the validity of a walk for peace. But you cannot argue with a dog wagging its tail. I watched it happen time and time again. A truck would pull over. The driver's face set in a hard scowl, skepticism written in the lines of his forehead. He'd step out, arms crossed, looking at the monks like they were intruders. And then Aloka would trot up. She didn't care about his politics. She didn't care about his denomination. She just saw a human. She'd nudge his hand, and I watched the armor fall. The crossed arms would drop. The scowl would soften into a half smile. Is that your dog? She walks with us, the monks would say. And suddenly, the conversation wasn't about Buddhism or global conflict. It was about sore paws. It was about tick medication. It was about water bowls. Aloka the peace dog built a bridge over the cultural chasm that 2,000 years of theology couldn't cross. Through her, the locals saw the monks not as foreign mystics, but as guys who loved a dog. And once that connection was made, once the healing began on that microscopic canine level, the donations started to flow. Water bottles, sandwiches, a safe place to sleep in a barn. I realized then that my calculations were missing a variable. I was measuring the strength of their arguments, but I should have been measuring the strength of their vulnerability. They weren't conquering these towns with logic. They were disarming them with innocence. But the South is warm. The South is hospitable in its own way. We were heading north. The calendar was turning to January. The heat was about to be replaced by a cold that doesn't care about your philosophy. The physics of softness was about to face the thermodynamics of freezing. January 2026, the Carolinas. If Texas was the fire, this was the ice. The weather maps turned a bruised purple. A polar vortex dipped its fingers down the east coast, turning the landscape into a glass sculpture. Logic dictates that you stop. When the temperature drops below freezing, and you are wearing nothing but a single layer of cotton, and your feet are bare against the ground, you stop. Biology demands it. Survival instincts scream it. But the river kept flowing. The visual of that week haunts me. I want you to picture it. A world erased by white snow. Gray sky, white ground, black asphalt. A monochrome void. And cutting through it, a stark, defiant line of bright orange. The saffron robes against the snow didn't look real. They looked like a glitch in the simulation, a fire that wouldn't go out. I watched them step onto the ice. I watched skin touch frozen sludge. I winced. Every step was a calculation of pain. I waited for them to break. I waited for the frostbite to win. I waited for the collective hero to finally admit that they were just men, and that men are fragile. But they didn't break. They entered a state of rhythm that I couldn't comprehend. So they weren't fighting the cold. They were accepting it. They were walking into the suffering, absorbing it into the collective body. It was terrifying to watch. It was the most inefficient way to travel I had ever seen, and yet it was the most beautiful thing I had ever witnessed. It stripped away all the pretenses of the modern world. There were no politics in the snow. There was no left or right in the frost. There was only the brutal truth of the human body pushing against the elements for something it believed in. And that is when the silence broke. Remember the secret loop I was watching for? The invisible obstacle? Back in Florida, I was convinced that apathy would kill this mission. I thought the world was too loud, too busy, and too cynical to care about 19 men walking. I thought they would walk 2,300 miles in a vacuum, unignored by the masses, shouting into a void. I was wrong. The snow changed everything. You see, suffering is a universal language. When people saw these men walking barefoot in the freezing rain, something inside the American psyche snapped. The cynicism evaporated. The "why are they doing this?" turned into, "oh my God, look at them." The apathy died the moment the first snowflake touched a shaved head. I saw a woman in North Carolina standing by the side of the road. She wasn't a Buddhist. She probably couldn't find Sri Lanka on a map. But she was weeping. She was holding a thermos of hot soup, shaking in the cold, waiting for them to pass. She wasn't crying for them. She was crying with them. The sight of their vulnerability had unlocked something in her. A grief, a hope, a need for healing. And then there was Aloka, the peace dog. The cold was too much for her paws. The mascot, the diplomat, the bridge. She was failing. She limped. She whined. The elements were indiscriminate, and the response was overwhelming. It wasn't just the monks carrying her. The crowds wanted to carry her. People offered blankets, booties, heaters. A veterinarian drove 3 hours just to check her pads. Aloka the peace dog wasn't just a dog anymore. She was the baby of the nation. Everyone wanted to protect the thing that represented innocence. In that snowstorm, the Saffron River didn't just survive. It flooded. It overflowed its banks. The bystanders were no longer watching. They were walking. A veteran in a wheelchair rolled alongside them for a mile. A group of teenagers put down their phones and walked in silence. I realized then that the walk for peace wasn't about the destination. It was about the wake it left behind. The monks were the rock and the world was the water? No. The world was the frozen ice, and the monks were the heat. They were melting the cynicism one step at a time. I stopped taking notes on efficiency. I stopped calculating the ROI. I just walked. I wrapped my coat tighter, looked at the orange line cutting through the white abyss, and for the first time in 2,300 miles, I didn't feel the cold. I felt the healing. February 2026, Washington, D.C. The river finally met the ocean. After 2,300 miles of asphalt, gravel, ice, and blood, the walk for peace arrived at the steps of the Capitol. The visual contrast was jarring. Behind them stood the marble monuments of power, rigid, white, imposing. In front of them stood the monks, weather-beaten, sun-darkened, their robes stained with the dust of a dozen states. They looked exhausted. Physically, they were depleted. Bodies were thinner. Feet were scarred. The wheelchair that carried Ponte Dame rattled on the pavement. By every medical metric, they were weaker than when they started. But by every other metric, they were invincible. I stood there, watching them close the circle, and I realized how foolish my initial calculations had been. I had measured their journey in miles. I should have measured it in heartbeats. I looked at the faces in the crowd surrounding them. It wasn't just curious tourists anymore. I saw the truck driver from Texas. I saw the woman from North Carolina. I saw the skeptics, the believers, the angry, and the lost. They had all been pulled into the current. I realized then that I was never just an observer. I was the rock. My cynicism, my demand for efficiency, my belief that force is the only language the world speaks, that was the hard edge that needed to be smoothed down. It took 2,300 miles of water flowing over me to finally wear it away. The healing they spoke of wasn't a magic spell. It was an erosion. It was the slow, painful process of wearing down the defenses we build around our hearts. We think our anger protects us. We think our walls keep us safe. But these men, with nothing but their vulnerability, walked right through our walls. They proved that peace is not passive. Peace is not sitting in a room wishing for the world to be better. Peace is active. It is aggressive. It walks on bleeding feet into the snow. It takes the hit from the truck and offers compassion in return. It carries the dog when the road gets too rough. The walk for peace wasn't a protest. It was a demonstration of a superior technology, the technology of the human spirit. The walk is over. The monks will return to their temples. The robes will be washed. The blisters will heal. The cameras will turn off, and the news cycle will move on to the next tragedy, the next scandal, the next noise. But the water has already changed the landscape. You cannot unsee what happened on that highway. You cannot unfeel the silence they brought to the chaos. The seed has been planted in the soil of this divided nation. So, what do we do now? The skeptic in me, the old voice, would say, nothing changed. The world is still dangerous. The politicians are still arguing. But the new voice, the one that walked the last mile with them, knows better. The river doesn't stop just because it reached the sea. It evaporates. It becomes rain. It falls back down on the mountains and starts again. The responsibility now shifts from their feet to ours. You don't have to shave your head. You don't have to walk across the country. You don't have to sleep in the snow. But you do have to find your own way to be the water. In a world that screams, be the silence. In a world that strikes, be the one who heals. In a world that builds walls, be the one who carries the dog across the bridge. The healing of a nation doesn't happen in the Senate. It happens on the sidewalk. It happens in the grocery store. It happens when you choose softness over hardness, when you choose to flow around the obstacle rather than crash into it. They showed us the way. The map is drawn in saffron. The walk for peace has ended, but the walk for us has just begun.